Imagine a California summer evening in the late 1960s. Warm air, laughter echoing from couples driving along the winding back roads, young people chasing freedom, music, and love in an era defined by rebellion and change. The world seemed alive, but under that golden glow, something far darker stirred. What if I told you that in those quiet towns, Vallejo, Benicia, and San Francisco, an invisible shadow lurked? A man who killed not just with bullets and knives, but with words, puzzles, and terror itself. What if I told you this killer never faced justice, and even today, decades later, his identity remains unknown? This is not just another crime story. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, America's real-life boogeyman. But before we begin, let me ask you something directly. What if the Zodiac isn't just a relic of the past, but a shadow that still looms today? Could he have lived a quiet life after his reign of terror, blending in with neighbors, unnoticed, even loved, while carrying the weight of unspeakable crimes? Or is it possible his twisted game still continues in ways we haven't even realized? Stick with me, because tonight on Criminal Codex, we'll dive deep into the chilling mystery of the Zodiac Killer, his murders, his messages, the suspects, and the questions that haunt us to this very day. And if you enjoy this journey into the darkest corners of crime, make sure you're subscribed, because we uncover cases that others only dare to whisper about. The summer of 1968 felt endless. But on December 20th, as David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen parked along Lake Herman Road, their youthful innocence met something unimaginable. Their car sat in the stillness of night, just like so many young couples before them. But out of the darkness came something they could never escape. A man approached, armed, ruthless. Shots rang out. Betty Lou tried to flee, but bullets tore through her back as she collapsed on the roadside. David was found slumped inside the car, a single bullet wound ending his life. There was no robbery, no clear motive, just a cold, merciless execution. The community was stunned. Who would commit such a senseless act? Police scrambled, but answers were nowhere to be found. And this was just the beginning. Fast forward to July 4th, 1969, Independence Day. Fireworks filled the skies above Vallejo as a young couple, Darlene Farron and Michael McGow, sat in their parked car. The night should have been filled with celebration, but it was shattered by gunfire. A man stepped from the shadows, firing relentlessly into the car. Darlene was struck multiple times, her life slipping away before help could arrive. Michael survived, though gravely wounded. His testimony would provide police with their first real description: a stocky man, around 5'8", with light hair and glasses. But what truly set this case apart wasn't just the violence, it was what came after. On August 1st, 1969, 3 letters arrived at local newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each one began with the same chilling words: "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." For the first time, the world knew his name, not one given by police, but one he chose for himself. Enclosed in those letters was something even sinister: a cipher, 408 characters long, a puzzle he demanded the newspapers print on their front pages. He claimed it would reveal his identity. He threatened that if his demands weren't met, he would go on a killing spree, targeting buses and picking off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. Imagine the terror that gripped the city: parents clutching their children tighter, teachers wondering if buses were safe. Law enforcement, desperate to decode the puzzle, realized this was no ordinary killer. This was someone who craved attention, control, and most disturbingly, power through fear. The 408 cipher was eventually cracked, not by police, but by a schoolteacher and his wife. The solution? A chilling confession that ended not with a name, but with a taunt: "I like killing people because it is so much fun." He described murder as the most thrilling experience, comparing it to hunting dangerous game. But the final words sent a shiver down spines everywhere: "I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." This was no ordinary murderer. This was someone who believed, or at least wanted us to believe, that his killings were part of some grand, twisted design. The Zodiac had entered the stage, and he had no intention of leaving quietly. Only weeks later, September 27, 1969, the horror returned. College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by Lake Berryessa when a man approached. But this wasn't just a shooter in the shadows. He wore a black executioner's hood with the Zodiac symbol drawn across his chest. He tied them up, stabbing Brian and Cecilia repeatedly before carving his mark into Brian's car door, the Zodiac symbol, along with the dates of his previous murders. Cecilia died 2 days later. Brian survived, his testimony giving the world a haunting glimpse of the killer's ritualistic brutality. And just when police thought they might predict his pattern, he changed it again. On October 11, 1969, San Francisco cab driver Paul Stein picked up a passenger in the city's Presidio Heights neighborhood. The ride ended in blood. Stein was shot in the head, his wallet and keys taken. But unlike his earlier attacks, this one had witnesses. 3 teenagers saw the killer wipe down the cab and walk away. They called police, who arrived within minutes. Officers even stopped a man matching the description nearby, but were told to look for a black suspect, a devastating miscommunication that allowed the Zodiac to walk free. The killer later mocked this blunder in a letter, bragging that police had missed their chance. And so the city remained paralyzed. By now, the Zodiac wasn't just a killer. He was a ghost, a manipulator, and a performer who orchestrated terror like theater. Every letter dripped with arrogance. Every cipher was a dare. Every murder, or claim of one, left investigators grasping for answers. But one question lingered above all. Who was he?
The letters poured in with a disturbing regularity, each one more unsettling than the last. Some contained coded ciphers, intricate puzzles that the killer claimed would reveal his identity if solved. Others were filled with chilling boasts about his crimes and threats of future violence. In one of his most infamous letters, the Zodiac brazenly declared, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." That single line, dripping with cruelty, etched itself into the collective memory of the American public. This wasn't just a murderer, this was someone who craved an audience, someone who needed to be seen, heard, and feared. The first cipher, known today as the 408, arrived in pieces, sent to 3 separate newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. The killer demanded that each paper publish their portion of the cipher on the front page, or he would strike again. Reluctantly, the papers complied. Within days, 2 school teachers, Donald and Betty Harden, managed to crack the code. But instead of revealing a name, the message was a chilling manifesto. It described his desire to hunt humans as though they were animals, a grotesque thrill that brought him pleasure. Yet at the end, a cruel twist. The Zodiac signed off by saying his identity would remain a mystery, hidden within another puzzle. It was a psychological game, and the entire Bay Area was caught in the middle of it. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to coordinate, but the killer exploited their every weakness. Local police, the FBI, and the press became unwilling participants in his macabre theater. Each new cipher sparked waves of panic and obsession. Families sat at kitchen tables trying to decode the cryptograms. Amateur sleuths stayed up late into the night, convinced they could unlock the killer's secret. The Zodiac had turned the public into detectives and himself into the ringmaster of a deadly spectacle. But what made this all the more terrifying was his unpredictability. Unlike many serial killers who followed patterns, the Zodiac seemed to thrive on chaos. His victims were chosen seemingly at random: young couples parked in lovers' lanes, lone taxi drivers on city streets. He used different weapons, a knife in one attack, a gun in another. Nothing fit a clean mold, and that made him all the harder to track. One of the most horrifying encounters came on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa. A young couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were enjoying a quiet picnic when a man in a bizarre hooded costume approached them. His outfit was chillingly theatrical, a black executioner-style hood with a white cross-circle symbol on the chest, the very same symbol he had been using in his letters. Armed with a knife and a gun, he bound the couple and then stabbed them repeatedly before calmly walking away. Cecilia tragically died from her wounds, while Brian miraculously survived and gave a detailed description of the attacker's eerie costume. The Zodiac had escalated not just in violence, but in theatrics. Only 2 weeks later, he struck again. This time in San Francisco, a taxi driver named Paul Stein was shot in the head by a passenger he had picked up. Witnesses saw the killer wipe down the cab before strolling casually away. Initially, police dismissed it as a routine robbery, but then the Zodiac himself sent Paul Stein's bloody shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle, proving beyond any doubt that he was responsible. He mocked the police for failing to catch him, even boasting that children were his next potential targets. The threat was so severe that school buses in the Bay Area were escorted by police cars. Parents were terrified. The killer had successfully transformed daily life into a waking nightmare. As the letters continued, the ciphers grew more complex. The infamous 340 cipher, mailed in 1969, went unsolved for over 50 years. It wasn't until 2020 that a team of amateur codebreakers finally cracked it. The message was classic Zodiac, rambling, mocking, taunting, and yet once again it revealed no name, no concrete clue to his identity. Just smoke and mirrors, designed to keep the world guessing. But behind the theatrics and the puzzles, there were real human costs. Families were torn apart, young lives were brutally cut short, communities were haunted by the knowledge that a faceless predator could strike anywhere, at any time. And with each passing year, the frustration grew. How could a killer who had left behind so many clues, so many letters, and so many witnesses remain free? Investigators pored over handwriting samples, desperately trying to match the Zodiac's scrawled letters to potential suspects. They collected fingerprints, examined tire tracks, and followed every lead. And yet, time and again, the trail went cold. It was as if the killer was always one step ahead, anticipating their every move. And this brings us to the question that has consumed generations of investigators, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts alike. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Was he someone hiding in plain sight, blending seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life? Or was he a drifter, moving silently from one town to the next, leaving chaos in his wake? Over the years, a number of suspects have risen to prominence. Each one brought with them a trail of circumstantial evidence, tantalizing clues, and maddening inconsistencies. One of the most infamous names is Arthur Lee Allen, a school teacher with a troubled past. He owned a Zodiac brand watch with the killer's symbol, was accused of disturbing behavior, and lived near several of the crime scenes. Handwriting experts never matched him to the Zodiac letters, and despite years of scrutiny, no definitive link was ever established. Others, like Richard Gaikowski, a journalist with a radical streak, and Earl Van Best Jr., whose photo allegedly resembled a police sketch of the Zodiac, have fueled theories and debates. DNA evidence from the killer's letters was tested against these suspects, but results were inconclusive or failed to match. It was a maddening cycle of hope and disappointment, and with each passing decade, the truth seemed to drift further out of reach. Yet even with all the uncertainty, the Zodiac's hold on the public imagination never wavered. He wasn't just a criminal, he had become a ghost story, a boogeyman, a figure of endless speculation. Hollywood turned his crimes into films. Authors filled libraries with books dissecting every angle of the case, and amateur detectives, armed with the internet, dedicated their lives to solving the puzzle. Some believed the answers were hidden in plain sight within the ciphers. Others were convinced that overlooked clues could still crack the case wide open. The Zodiac had done what few killers in history could achieve. He had become immortal, not in body, but in legend.
Even decades later, the mystery of the Zodiac Killer refuses to fade. His shadow lingers not just over California, but over the entire history of crime in America. To this day, the unsolved case remains one of the most haunting examples of how a single person can outwit law enforcement and etch themselves permanently into the cultural psyche. But why does the Zodiac still fascinate us? Perhaps it's because he wasn't just a killer, he was a performer. He wrote his own script, and we were all forced to play our roles. The police, the press, the terrified public, each one was an unwilling actor in his twisted play. His crimes were horrifying, yes, but his manipulation of the media was unprecedented. He understood something that few criminals ever did. Fear spreads faster than bullets. Every letter he sent was like fuel on a fire. Headlines screamed his name. People whispered about him in hushed tones. Parents kept their children closer. No longer couples parked in secluded spots at night. The Zodiac had achieved exactly what he wanted: control, not just over his victims, but over an entire society. And yet, the man behind the mask remains unknown. This is where the obsession deepens. Over the years, the investigation spiraled into thousands of tips, countless hours of interviews, and mountains of evidence that seemed to lead nowhere. Forensic science advanced, but the Zodiac case always seemed to stay one step beyond reach. The FBI, at one point, dedicated some of their best agents to the case. They analyzed the handwriting, tested fingerprints, and even used cutting-edge DNA techniques. Still, nothing concrete ever emerged. The ciphers, the letters, the threats, they all kept pointing to a phantom, someone who could vanish as easily as he appeared. But let's pause for a moment and consider the human side of this story. Behind the headlines, behind the sensationalism, there were victims whose lives were stolen in an instant. Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, the young couple shot on their first date. Darlene Ferrin, a young mother, brutally gunned down in her car. Cecilia Shepard, whose final hours at Lake Berryessa were filled with unimaginable terror. Paul Stein, a hardworking taxi driver, murdered in cold blood. Each name represents a life cut short and families who never received the justice they deserved. And then there are their survivors. Brian Hartnell, who lived to tell the story of that terrifying day at Lake Berryessa. His voice carried the details of a man dressed like an executioner, a memory that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. These survivors became unwilling witnesses to one of the darkest chapters in American history, their lives forever scarred by the Zodiac's cruelty. As the years rolled on, theories about the killer's identity multiplied. Some believed he was a local man, someone who blended so well into everyday life that no one would suspect him. Others argued that he may have been connected to the military, citing his knowledge of ciphers and his apparent skill with weapons. A few went even further, suggesting that he may have been part of law enforcement, using inside knowledge to outmaneuver investigators. None of these theories ever gained absolute proof, but each added another layer of intrigue. And this is the paradox of the Zodiac. Every answer only seemed to open up more questions. By the 1970s, his letters began to slow, and eventually they stopped altogether. But the fear never truly went away. San Francisco and the surrounding areas remained haunted by the possibility that the Zodiac was still out there, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. And then came Hollywood. In 1971, director Don Siegel's Dirty Harry hit theaters, with Clint Eastwood facing off against a fictionalized version of the Zodiac called the Scorpion Killer. Audiences flocked to see it, and the legend grew. Decades later, in 2007, David Fincher's film Zodiac reignited global fascination with the case, introducing a new generation to the mystery. The killer had become larger than life, a figure who transcended crime reports to become a symbol of fear itself. But while Hollywood dramatized, real investigators kept digging. Amateur sleuths, ordinary people with extraordinary determination, joined the hunt. They pored over the ciphers, analyzed handwriting samples, and debated endlessly on forums and websites. Some became so consumed by the case that it took over their lives. For them, solving the Zodiac wasn't just about justice, it was about closure, about conquering a riddle that had haunted America for over half a century. And then came a moment that seemed like a breakthrough. In 2020, a team of codebreakers cracked the Zodiac's 340 cipher. For decades, experts had failed, but this group succeeded, using modern computing power and collaboration. The message, once decoded, was another taunt. The killer gloated that he was not afraid of the gas chamber because death would bring him paradise. It was chilling, it was disturbing, and it was a stark reminder that even in his words, he offered no answers, only more questions. But let's step back and consider something important. What if the Zodiac Killer isn't just a figure from the past? What if his shadow still looms over us today? He may be long gone, perhaps even dead. But the fear he inspired, the games he played, and the questions he left behind, they remain as potent as ever. And maybe that was his ultimate victory. Not the murders themselves, but the immortality of his mystery. And so, the legend continues. From Vallejo to San Francisco, from dusty case files to modern internet forums, the Zodiac Killer is still very much alive in our collective imagination. He is the monster who was never caught, the riddle that was never solved. And as long as the case remains unsolved, his story will continue to echo, a chilling reminder of how one man's cruelty can cast a shadow across generations. But here's the burning question we must all ask ourselves. Will we ever truly know the identity of the Zodiac Killer? Or is his mask destined to remain forever intact, his name forever hidden, his crimes forever unsolved? The Zodiac case sits in that rare space between history and myth. It's real, and yet it feels almost unreal. A figure who should have been caught, who should have left behind a trail of undeniable evidence, instead evaporated into the shadows. Every generation since has picked up the pieces, tried to solve the puzzle, and failed. And in that failure, the Zodiac has become something more than a man. He has become a legend of fear. But legends, no matter how terrifying, always come from truth. Somewhere out there, behind all the theories and suspects and endless speculation, there was a real person who held that gun, who wrote those letters, who carved his place in history through terror. That reality is what makes this story so unsettling. We're not talking about a ghost or a monster from folklore. We're talking about a human being who lived among us, who looked ordinary, who may have been the man you passed on the street or stood behind in line at the grocery store. That ordinariness, combined with the cruelty of his acts, is what made the Zodiac so chilling. Investigators have put forth names over the years. Arthur Lee Allen, perhaps the most famous suspect, seemed to fit in many ways. His obsession with ciphers, his disturbing history, even circumstantial evidence linking him to certain crimes. Yet the hard proof never materialized. DNA cleared him decades later. Others have been suggested. Richard Gaikowski, whose work in journalism and presence in San Francisco seemed suspicious. Lawrence Kane, with ties to some of the areas where the Zodiac struck. And even more obscure figures, each with their own strange overlaps with the case. But every time the puzzle pieces start to line up, they inevitably fall apart. That's the agony of the Zodiac investigation. It always feels just one step away from resolution. A new suspect emerges, a new piece of evidence is revealed, a cipher is cracked, and yet the case always slips back into uncertainty. Like smoke in the wind, the Zodiac never allows himself to be captured, not in handcuffs, not even in truth. And what of modern science? Today, we live in an era of extraordinary forensic breakthroughs. Cold cases decades old are being solved through genetic genealogy, where DNA samples are compared to online family trees. Killers, once thought untouchable, are finally being identified and brought to justice. Could the Zodiac be next? Some investigators and amateurs alike believe that the answer lies in preserved evidence from the crime scenes. If viable DNA still exists, then perhaps the killer's identity could be uncovered in the future. But time is the greatest enemy here. The Zodiac case is over half a century old. Witnesses have passed away. Detectives who worked the case have retired or died. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. And with every passing year, the possibility of ever knowing the truth becomes slimmer. But the fascination doesn't fade. Instead, it grows. The Zodiac has become more than an unsolved case. He has become a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that evil can exist without explanation, that sometimes justice is denied, and that human curiosity will always chase after answers, even if they remain forever out of reach. And maybe that's the final cruelty of the Zodiac. Not the lives he took, terrible as they were, not even the fear he spread, vast as it was, but the fact that he denied the world closure. He ensured that his victims' families, his investigators, and even ordinary people who became obsessed with the mystery would never have the satisfaction of an ending. The story doesn't end. It just lingers, gnawing at us, pulling us back again and again to those ciphers, those letters, those horrific crime scenes. But as we sit here today, decades later, we have to ask ourselves, do we want the mystery solved, or is part of us addicted to the unknown? The Zodiac Killer may have murdered, may have mocked the police, may have disappeared, but in some twisted way, he also gave us one of the greatest riddles of the modern age. And perhaps that's why we keep coming back, not just for justice, but for the chase itself. Think about it. Every time a theory surfaces, every time a cipher is cracked, every time a new suspect's name trends online, people across the world lean in just a little closer. They want to be part of the unraveling. They want to be there if the mask finally falls. The Zodiac, even in silence, still commands our attention. So, will we ever know? Will the final clue appear? Will DNA testing hand us a name? Will the last cipher finally spill the truth? Or is the Zodiac destined to remain what he has always been? A faceless shadow, a reminder that sometimes evil cannot be fully explained or defeated. One thing is certain, the Zodiac Killer changed America forever. He changed how we view serial killers. He changed how the media and police interact with criminals who crave attention. And he left us with the most terrifying possibility of all, that some mysteries never end. And maybe that's why his story endures, because deep down, we're all haunted by questions without answers. This has been the story of the Zodiac Killer, the man who taunted, who terrified, and who vanished. The case remains open, The mystery remains alive, and the shadow of the Zodiac still stretches across time, daring us to keep searching. So now I turn the question to you. Who do you think the Zodiac really was? Was he one of the prime suspects, hiding in plain sight? Or was he someone we've never even considered? Could he still be out there? Or is he nothing more than bones in an unmarked grave, laughing at us from the past? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, true crime mysteries that continue to puzzle the world, make sure you subscribe to Criminal Codex. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next deep dive into the darkest corners of history. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we hunt the truth. And sometimes the truth is stranger, scarier, and more haunting than anything you could imagine. This is Criminal Codex, signing off.